With a vivid red mounting to her forehead, Pollyanna spoke again brokenly. "Jimmy, if you could only tell Aunt Polly something about your father and your people, and—" Jimmy's arms dropped suddenly. He stepped back a little. The color drained from his face. "Is that it?" he asked. "Yes." Pollyanna came nearer and touched his arm timidly. "Don't think it isn't from me, Jimmy. I don't care. Besides, I know that your father and your people were all fine and noble, because you are so fine and noble. But Jimmy, don't look at me like that!" But Jimmy, with a low moan, had turned quite away from her. A minute later, with only a few choking words which she could not understand, he had left the house. From the Harrington homestead, Jimmy went straight home and sought out John Pendleton. He found him in the great crimson-hung library where, some years before, Pollyanna had looked fearfully about for the skeleton in John Pendleton's closet. "Uncle John, do you remember that packet Father gave me?" demanded Jimmy. "Why, yes. What's the matter, son?" John Pendleton had given a start of surprise at the sight of Jimmy's face. "That packet has got to be opened, sir." "But the conditions—" "I can't help it. It's got to be. That's all. Will you do it?" "Why, yes, my boy, of course, if you insist. But—" He paused helplessly. "Uncle John, as perhaps you have guessed, I love Pollyanna. I asked her to be my wife, and she consented." The elder man made a delighted exclamation, but the other did not pause or change his sternly intent expression. "She says now she can't marry me. Mrs. Chilton objects. She objects to me." "Objects to you!" John Pendleton's eyes flashed angrily. "Yes. I found out why when Pollyanna begged if I couldn't tell her aunt something about my father and my people." "Shucks! I thought Polly Chilton had more sense. Still, it's just like her, after all. The Harringtons have always been inordinately proud of race and family," snapped John Pendleton. "Well, could you?" "Could I? It was on the end of my tongue to tell Pollyanna that there couldn't have been a better father than mine was. Then suddenly I remembered the packet and what it said, and I was afraid. I didn't dare say a word till I knew what was inside that packet. There's something Dad didn't want me to know till I was 30 years old, when I would be a man grown and could stand anything. See? There's a secret somewhere in our lives. I've got to know that secret, and I've got to know it now." "But, Jimmy, lad, don't look so tragic. It may be a good secret. Perhaps it'll be something you'll like to know." "Perhaps. But if it had been, would he have been apt to keep it from me till I was 30 years old? No, Uncle John. It was something he was trying to save me from till I was old enough to stand it, and not flinch. Understand, I'm not blaming Dad. Whatever it was something he couldn't help, I'll warrant. But what it was I've got to know. Will you get it, please? It's in your safe, I know." John Pendleton rose at once. "I'll get it," he said. 3 minutes later it lay in Jimmy's hand, but Jimmy held it out at once. "I would rather you read it, sir, please, than tell me." "But, Jimmy, Very well." With a decisive gesture, John Pendleton picked up a paper cutter, opened the envelope, and pulled out the contents. There was a package of several papers tied together, and one folded sheet alone, apparently a letter. This John Pendleton opened and read first. And as he read, Jimmy, tense and breathless, watched his face. He saw, therefore, the look of amazement, joy, and something else he could not name, that leaped into John Pendleton's countenance. "Uncle John, what is it? What is it?" he demanded. "Read it for yourself," answered the man, thrusting the letter into Jimmy's outstretched hand. And Jimmy read this: "The enclosed papers are the legal proof that my boy Jimmy is really James Kent, son of John Kent, who married Doris Weatherby, daughter of William Weatherby of Boston. There is also a letter in which I explain to my boy why I have kept him from his mother's family all these years. If this packet is opened by him at 30 years of age, he will read this letter, and I hope will forgive a father who feared to lose his boy entirely, so took this drastic course to keep him to himself. If it is opened by strangers because of his death, I request that his mother's people in Boston be notified at once, and the enclosed package of papers be given intact into their hands. John Kent." Jimmy was pale and shaken when he looked up to meet John Pendleton's eyes. "Am I the lost Jamie?" "The letter says you have documents there to prove it," nodded the other. "Mrs. Carew's nephew?" "Of course." "But why, what? I can't realize it." There was a moment's pause before into Jimmy's face flashed a new joy. "Then surely now I know who I am. I can tell Mrs. Chilton something of my people." "I should say you could," retorted John Pendleton dryly. "The Boston Weatherbys can trace straight back to the Crusades, and I don't know but to the year 1. That ought to satisfy her. As for your father, he came of good stock, too, Mrs. Carew told me, though he was rather eccentric and not pleasing to the family, as you know, of course." "Yes, poor Dad. And what a life he must have lived with me all those years, always dreading pursuit. I can understand lots of things now that used to puzzle me. A woman called me Jamie once. Jove, how angry he was! I know now why he hurried me away that night without even waiting for supper. Poor Dad! It was right after that he was taken sick. He couldn't use his hands or his feet, and very soon he couldn't talk straight. Something ailed his speech. I remember when he died he was trying to tell me something about this packet. I believe now he was telling me to open it and go to my mother's people, but I thought that he was just telling me to keep it safe, so that's what I promised him. But it didn't comfort him any. It only seemed to worry him more. You see, I didn't understand. Poor Dad!" "Suppose we take a look at these papers," suggested John Pendleton. "Besides, there's a letter from your father to you, I understand. Don't you want to read it?" "Yes, of course. And then—" The young fellow laughed shamefacedly and glanced at the clock. "I was wondering just how soon I could go back to Pollyanna." A thoughtful frown came to John Pendleton's face. He glanced at Jimmy, hesitated, then spoke. "I know you want to see Pollyanna, lad, and I don't blame you. But it strikes me that under the circumstances you should go first to Mrs. Carew and take these." He tapped the papers before him. Jimmy drew his brows together and pondered. "All right, sir, I will," he agreed resignedly. "And if you don't mind, I'd like to go with you," further suggested John Pendleton, a little diffidently. I have a little matter of my own that I'd like to see your aunt about. Suppose we go down today on the 3 o'clock." "Good. We will, sir. Gorry! And so I'm Jamie! I can't grasp it yet," exclaimed the young man, springing to his feet and restlessly moving about the room. "I wonder now." He stopped and colored boyishly. "Do you think Aunt Ruth will mind very much?" John Pendleton shook his head. A hint of the old somberness came into his eyes. "Hardly, my boy. but I'm thinking of